I'm excited for you. So many good things are happening. I was reading the New York Times and I'm like, Brad,
Yeah, that was
that
a
was
pleasant
big.
surprise to get that piece in there.
Yeah, congratulations. That's big. And I'm sure lots of other good things are happening. First of all, I adore your book. I love everything about it.
Thank you.
But one way I thought we could go about it would be those 5 questions at the
Mm,
end, which I actually think really summarize well all of the concepts of the book. But
yeah,
one way I thought we could organize it would be me just asking you that question on a personal
I
level,
love it. No
and
one's
then
even
you
come
and
close
then
to
you
doing
talking
that.
about the why behind it. Yeah, and then you talking about the why behind it, because the why behind it's a book, but I'm actually curious for you, your answers to those, because
Yeah.
I mean, you're
Ooh, this
going through
sounds
so much
great.
change. We all are.
I'm
Yeah?
excited.
Yeah, yeah. Let's make
Yeah,
it
that
personal.
sounds great.
Okay.
Cool.
So, you ready to get going on
Yeah,
that?
let's do it. This will be fun and challenging.
Fun and challenging. Yeah. Well, that's good. So, number 1, where in your life are you pursuing fixity where it might be beneficial to open yourself to the possibility, or in some cases, the inevitability of change? So I'd love for you to answer that and then also tell us why you asked us that question after you answer it personally for yourself.
So, I think that the short answer, and then I'll get into the longer answer, is perhaps in how I relate to physical performance. I've been an
Mm,
athlete forever, and I've gone through multiple phases of being an athlete, a team sport athlete, an endurance athlete. Now I'm very into strength training, but I'm still an athlete that is goal driven and that likes to shoot for certain targets, whether that is a sub 3 marathon, a 500-pound deadlift, whatever it might be. And I think that on the one hand, it's very motivating to have those goals, and there's something very nice about it. But on the other hand, I think in some ways I'm addicted to progress. And I'm having this
mhm.
creeping sense as
Aren't
I
we all?
age that it might be interesting
Yeah.
to just try to enjoy fitness for fitness. Just train to train, not with a goal in mind, not need a program, not need to deadlift 3 days a week and think, well, if I hike this day, then I'll miss a deadlift day and that might set me back from my goal. Just to let go of that goal driven mindset as it relates to physical fitness. And I think it would open up more space, perhaps, for enjoyment and ease. So that's the
Yeah.
specific answer. I think the longer term answer is this tension that I experience that I think is quite universal, especially amongst people that are goal driven and are motivated by excellence, is wanting to focus on various crafts in my life and get the most out of myself in those crafts, but also wanting to make sure that I slow down and actually enjoy the process as much as I write that we all should enjoy the process. And I think that there is a tension between striving for a goal and completely letting go. And I think in certain settings, if you are devoted to a very spiritual existence and you go to a monastery, it's much easier to completely let go. And then on the other extreme, if you're an Olympian, well, you have to be pretty goal driven. But I think the rest of us, we exist somewhere in between those extremes. And it's just a constant tension. Am I holding on too tight to the pursuit of goals, or am I holding on at the right grip?
Well, I do go to monasteries and it's still hard for me to let go. So I don't know. You know, it's actually in the monastery that it's the hardest, because all of the crap shows that you realize how rigid you are, how rigid I am, how fixed I am. It comes with us. It packs our bags to the monastery or to the Olympic trials. And I love that answer, because you're highlighting a couple things in there. You're highlighting the inevitability of change. And you said in there, as I age, which is one of those things that has to do with change and that our bodies change. What hooked me on your book was the discussion about homeostasis versus allostasis. Tell us a little bit about that, because this is also related to our relationship with change and our expectations around what change looks like.
Homeostasis is about 500 years old, is a way of thinking. The concept itself was coined in 1865, and it essentially describes change as a pattern of order, disorder, and then back to order. And inherent to homeostasis is that living systems, whether that's individuals, family units, organizations, entire cultures, and species, we really crave stability. And when anything becomes a threat to our stability, when anything brings about disorder, well, the goal is to push back against that, right? Or to get back to order as fast as we can. And for the longest time, that was the prevailing model of change in the scientific community. And only more recently have scientists stepped back and said, actually, when we look at individuals that really thrive and flourish over the long haul, they don't follow that pattern of order, disorder, order. They follow a pattern of order, disorder, reorder. So, yes, we want to attain and achieve stability, but that stability is reached somewhere new. We don't go back to where we were. Change is not something that happens to us, but something that we are inevitably in conversation with. And I think this shift in mindset and framing is so important because I grew up with this homeostatic model that change is the enemy and we want stability. And if we see change that way, if we see change as something that, again, that happens to us, well, when something happens to you, you take this step back and you put your arms up, you get on the defensive. Whereas if we can view change more accurately as an allostatic process, as a process that we're a part of, well, then we can try to shift our framing to see change as something that we are in conversation with. That is just the nature of reality. I mean, every wisdom tradition teaches impermanence. So, in many ways, this sounds kind of trite and cliche, but to fear change is to fear life. And we don't want to do that if we don't have to.
Order to disorder to reorder. I think every client in my practice heard this week from me because I was preparing to talk to you. And every single person that I shared this concept with, it was really relieving actually for them because the disorder that I'm in, and whether that was the disorder of moving, starting a new job, or a relationship conflict, figure out their marriage and have their marriage be different than the way that their marriage has been, all of those were examples of the disorder, the change that's happening, and that to have the idea of, okay, but we're going to reorder. We're going to something different. We're going to evolve. And this is part of the variation and the selection and the retention of evolution, that we're mixing things up. We don't have to go back to where we were. It gave them this yeah, like you said, a different mindset around change. And that's motivating for us to be able to do that letting go that you're talking about, whether it's like letting go of your weight training, maybe moving into a new different reorder of my relationship with my body and
That's right.
hope, really.
Yeah. In you can't get to reorder without disorder. So then the name of the game
Yeah.
is, well, how do you prepare yourself to navigate the disorder phase?
Hi, I'm Dr. Dinah Hill. Thank you so much for joining me with Your Life in Process. And if you want more, if you're interested in applying these processes to your daily life, join me at my membership, More Life in Process. At More Life in Process, you will get meditations for you to practice at home. You'll get extra bits from the episode that maybe got recorded after the fact. You're going to get PDFs and handouts, things that you can use to apply your daily practice to your life. And I can't wait to see you there. $5 a month, $50 for the year. You can go to yourlifeinprocess.com to sign up.
With as much grace as possible. And what's interesting is, so biologists would call this process allostasis. The
Mm-hmm.
Franciscan friar Richard Rohr has called this the universal wisdom pattern. Order, disorder, reorder. Like, he sees that as how we gain wisdom. The Buddhist teacher Mark Epstein has called this going to pieces without falling apart. In organizational science, management thinkers talk about how organizations go through cycles of freezing, unfreezing, and then refreezing. And then an evolutionary biologist or anthropologist would say this is simply how species evolve over time. So,
Yeah.
to me, I'm interested in looking for the convergence of these patterns from different lines of thought And that gives me confidence that this is true with a capital T, that there is no getting back to order, and that viewing change as something that happens to us sets us up to be on the defensive and resistant in a way that ultimately causes suffering. Whereas if we can learn to see change as, again, the ongoing nature of reality, something that we're in conversation with, it gives us the chance to open up to it. Um, and also, and I'm sure we'll discuss this later, we don't sacrifice all agency. Like change shapes us, but we can also shape change. We're in a dance with it.
Yeah. So a related concept to that is our expectations. We're shifting our expectations there in terms of reframing it. And one of the things that you talk a lot about in this book is reframing our expectations so that they're matching more what reality is, the reality of disorder, and as opposed to it should be in order. My house should be in order. Well, the reality is you're moving. It's in disorder. And so you had this question, your second question that I want to ask of you, and then we can talk more about unrealistic expectations and its role in change. But the second question is, in what parts of your life are you holding on to unrealistic expectations? And the listeners can think about this for themselves too.
I think the hours in the day. I think that I expect that there are more hours in the day than there actually are. Um, in my
Yeah.
own life, we recently transitioned from having one kid to two kids. And with that, as parents who are listeners know, you go from playing 2-on-1 double team defense to playing person on person defense, which is a lot more challenging. And I think that I could do a better job of setting myself appropriate expectations for the time that I'll have for doing deep work, and when I'll have that time versus holding on to old expectations. So when we just had one child, our routine was very much that the early mornings were time for me to do really my writing and my research. And my wife would do most of the morning work and take our kid to school. And then I would do the afternoon work. She's on Pacific hours. So it really worked nicely. But now we have an infant. And that has blown up our old morning routine. And I think there's a part of me that still wakes up and says, well, maybe I'll be able to get some of that like real peaceful incense lit coffee time to do like deep thinking work. And then 9 out of 10 times when my baby wakes up and prevents that, because my expectation was that I'd be able to do deep work, I resent the baby. I then resent myself for resenting the baby, and all those shoulds and judgmental thinking comes into play. So I didn't know I'd be getting a therapy session here, but I think for me, the just the shifting that, the mornings in particular, that was such a sacred time for me. And our daughter wakes up pretty early, so there's not much time to wake up earlier without sacrificing sleep. And I think realizing that this might be a phase where those mornings aren't just mine, and perhaps they'll be more joyful when they're not just mine, but that will only happen insofar as I release from the expectation that mornings will be time for me to do deep work.
If anything's going to teach you about change, it's babies, because they're on a rapid course of change.
Yeah.
Everything from as soon as you get your routine down, they're doing something else, and then you have to adjust and adapt with them. They're such good teachers, and if you hold on too tight, it will make you resent your baby. I appreciate you saying that, because oftentimes we don't talk about how we resent our kids.
And I think the
Absolutely.
framing is so important because I can pat myself on the back. What I have done since our second child was born is essentially observe a digital Sabbath. So on Saturday
Mhm.
morning to Sunday morning, all my devices are gone. I just have a flip phone for emergencies. So there's no expectation that I am going to write anything. Or if I am, it's just going to be jotting some thoughts down in a notebook. And I enjoy that time so much. It is sacred. I so look forward to it. And the early mornings could be very similar to that. So the only thing that's different is I have this expectation that I'm holding on to that like this is a time to be productive. And I don't know, maybe I will fully let go of it. Maybe there will be some hybrid approach. I mean, even right now I don't want to say that like I'm going to fully let go of it because sometimes I can get a lot done in the morning, but I think I have to be more fluid and flexible with it.
Yeah, more flexible with it, and maybe letting the concept of what it could look like be different.
Yeah, updating in real
Yeah.
time. Because if Lila is our beautiful daughter's name, if Lila sleeps in, like great, I'll be able to do the deep work. so on and so forth. If I'm up early, I will. But if I can't, then I can't. And I'm not going to sit there and leave the baby. Like, so I, what I'm actually doing, my physical expression in the world is the same. I am tending to and caring for this child, but what's happening underneath the hood looks so different based on whether or not I was able to update my expectation. Because if I was, I can really be there and I can like embrace the joy of being a parent to this baby girl. But if I'm still holding on to this notion that I should be doing work or I was supposed to be, then it's very easy to become resentful. But either way, I'm caring for the baby. So I think it's a prime example of saying that is the reality. The baby is up. And if I could just release from whatever I thought I would get done to be with what's in front of me, I would have so much more ease and enjoyment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think when we have young kids, we have the belief that it's going to be order, disorder, order.
Mm-hmm.
And even just the idea, sometimes I'll talk with clients that have young kids and they're like, wait, as soon as I get through the first 5 years, then I'll be able to get my life back. And I still have not gotten my life. I mean, everything has reordered and it continues to reorder. We go Friday mornings to this sunrise swim with his school. It's
Mm-hmm.
amazing. It's 6:45 in the morning. The whole school shows up and we go swimming in the ocean. It's a really cool thing. But I had this interview with you and he had English homework. And it was this similar kind of thing. Like I didn't want to let go of having dry hair
Yeah.
and being prepared for the interview. And I'm like, but that's how I do interviews is I blow dry my hair and I'm all prepared and I have everything to go. And he wanted to get his English homework done. And we were trying to figure out how we could make it all happen. Right. And it was actually in the letting go of making it all happen that allowed us to go because I have wet hair. You can't tell, but I have wet hair. And that's part of the reorder is in real time, what are your values and how do you put those up at the forefront and then not spend so much time in holding on and attaching to the expectation. A lot of times the letting go of the expectation is the reason why we can let go of it is because we've contacted our values.
That's
And
right.
I'm hearing in there you've contacted the value around being with your baby because you could make it happen where you hire someone to be with your baby in the morning or whatever so that you could write,
Yeah.
but you're
And
choosing to be with your baby.
so psychologists have this offhand equation that you're probably familiar with that our happiness or our mood at any given point of time is a function of our reality minus our expectations. And the bigger the gap, the more distress we feel. Now, people often say, does this mean that I should set low expectations? And I don't think that's the case. I think that we should set accurate expectations. And we can
Mm-hmm.
set high expectations of ourselves that are in alignment with our values for the things that we care about. But we should err on the side of conservative or lower expectations for external outcomes in the world around us. And that's how I, as a result of writing this book, have come to see that. And the other thing that I was going to say, and just being totally frank and being judgment neutral, in many ways, I think it is much easier to be a person that only cares about work, to be like the CEO or the person who is just so focused on work that nothing else matters and you will outsource everything. Or on the flip side, in the case of parenting, to be the parent where that kid is everything and you have no craft or work or creative aspirations, because then you don't have these values in conflict. And I think where the rubber meets the road is when you want to both be a present, loving, caring parent, when you want to excel at your craft, when you want to have a physical practice and take care of your health. I think that is where the challenge lies acutely. But in the long term, I actually think it makes us so much more robust and resilient to change. Because when your identity gets way too tightly fused to any single thing, and that thing shifts. So if you're the person whose whole identity is tied up in work and then you have a work failure or it's time to retire, that's a real crisis.
You're
Or the
so
parent
disappointed. Like your
who
whole
is,
ego deflates. Yeah.
yeah, the parent who is so just, I'm going to put everything else aside, but parenting my kids. Well, then if the kids thrive, flourish, and eventually live on their own, well, then that can be a big crisis. So I think like diversifying your sense of identity and having multiple values and having multiple things that you care about in the long term is really good and healthy. And it adds meaning and texture and ruggedness and flexibility to your life. But acutely, it brings lots of challenges because you're
Mm-hmm.
constantly evaluating these trade offs.
Mm-hmm. in ACT, we call that a shift from self as content. I'm a good parent, or I'm an on-time therapist, or whatever it is, whatever you over-identify with, to self as context, which is observing yourself as having many different aspects of who you are. And those change and flex over time. And then there's another concept in ACT, which is self as process, which is more has to do with relational frame theory and the idea behind your lived experience, the processes in which are showing up in your life. And when you're in the self as context and self as process, there's a lot more flexibility to who you are, and it's not quite as steep of a fall when things don't go your way. But so you're already leading us into this third question, which is, are there elements of your identity which you cling too tightly to? And we all have that. And if the listeners think about that for themselves, usually the elements of your identity that you're clinging too tightly to are also contributing to your pain points, like where you're having the most suffering during change. So whatever change you're going through in your life, because we're all going through some multiple at a certain point in time, where it's really kind of like ouchy is often because there's elements of your identity that you're trying to keep the same as that change is happening. So what's that for you, Brad?
Yeah, I think this is one where I don't want to say I'm skillful, but I'm more skillful here than some of the other domains. I
Mhm.
think I've done a pretty good job at diversifying my sense of self.
Mm,
I, I think of identity like a house. And if you only have one room in your identity house and that one room floods or catches fire, then there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to seek refuge. But if you have multiple rooms in your house, then if one room floods or catches fire, you can go seek refuge in the other rooms. So that is what scientists would call differentiation, right? Having multiple components to your identity. But then you also want to have really good hallways. Otherwise, navigating the house is really jerky and jarring. This is what researchers call integration. So the way that the different parts fit together. So for our identities, it's about having multiple components to our identities, but then having transitional routines and rituals to shift between them, and a story we tell ourselves about ourselves that integrates those. So in my identity house, the big rooms are family, which is partner to my wife and parent to my kids, craft, which for me is writing, um, community, which for me is being a good neighbor, really forging and actively working to forge bonds in my local community, athlete, which is my physical practice and training. And then it's a smaller room, and this is an intentional choice right now, is coaching for the couple of people in my coaching practice. And I think I do a really good job of holding those identities strongly at the same time. Now, I don't spend equal time in each of those rooms. Like I've made a conscious choice to scale back my coaching practice so I can spend more time in the writing room. And sometimes the family room is in conflict with the writing room. And I mentioned earlier that the athlete room is shifting. So I'm kind of renovating these rooms and I'm changing the balance of where I spend time, but I pat myself on the back here. I do a good job of not leaving any of those behind. I think acutely, you're catching me in a moment shortly after a book came out. I'm
yeah.
probably over indexing on not even the writer room, which would be fine, but the book sales room. And that is
Yeah.
a hellscape of a room to be in. That is the checking your book scan report to see how many copies you sold and are you a bestseller and what does that mean? And waking up and one of your first thoughts is, well, should I post on Instagram about my book today? And if so, what should I post? And it is an occupational hazard of any creative that also does this as a living. You have to play the commercial game, but it's just that it's a hazard. So I guess acutely right now, I'd like to work on stepping back from that room. Um, and yet, I'm also a pragmatist. So I've given myself until the end of the year. The book came out in September, so a solid 4 months to spend time in that room, and then just knowing that there can be like an addictive quality to that. So the off ramp might be challenging, but it's not my first rodeo. So it's like the metaphorical like hot shower and detox from the bender of trying to commercialize a piece of creative work.
Right. Yeah. Well, in part of that, there's sort of the domains of your life or the rooms of your life or the identities, whatever language you want to use around that. And I guess the way that I would think about that is how you spend your time for sure, but also how you show up in those spaces. And that's where values can be informative, because there's ways in which the context of selling a book is going to pull for certain types of responses from you, the context that triggers certain responses. But you can be intentional in being aware of, this doesn't feel good, and could I show up in a different way even as I'm selling books? And I think that you do actually do a good job of that, Brad. You show up as a human, you show up with your values at the forefront. You're checking yourself, because ego can go so high and so low within a short period of time. And people relate to that, whether they're selling a book or they're just posting stuff on social media, how your ego can go up and your ego can go down. And if you're caught up in that, as opposed to really having it be values driven, you're going to have a different experience of it in any of
Yeah,
those domains.
I couldn't
So,
agree more. And I think that the context is really important. Um,
yeah.
so having some solid boundaries and constraints, uh, whether that's a digital Sabbath or whether that is whenever I go to the gym, my phone is not on my person, or in the evenings for family time, here's how I'm going to separate the checking or the posting from real life. And this is going to look different for everyone. But I think environmental design can really help us facilitate the behaviors that we want. So in the moment, yes, you're relying on your values, but even upstream of the moment, I think that if we can use our values to kind of design our environment to be conducive to the behaviors that we want, um, that is really helpful. But again, zooming way out, because now we're talking about an acute time and in a conscious decision to spend a lot of time in one room. Zooming way out, the argument that I make is by having multiple rooms in your identity house, by diversifying your sense of self, you have an easier time navigating cycles of order, disorder, reorder, because you are just so much more rugged in the sense that you know your values, but then flexible in the sense that like there are these different components to your identity. So I don't know anything about finance except what's like the one thing that everyone knows. You want to have a quote unquote diversified portfolio. And why is this? Because if you only have your savings in one kind of asset and there's a big shift or change, that can be really, really scary, especially if it's a negative change. But if you have your assets in different holdings, then if there's a downturn in one area, the other areas, the other asset classes will buffer you and get you through. And I think it is
Yeah.
so important to diversify your sense of self. And you see the downside of this happen, particularly, I think it is an extreme example, but it's worth examining the extremes in truly world class caliber athletes, because their identities so often get fused with their pursuit. And it is a pursuit that generally you peak between age 24 and 30. And then you exit that. And if you don't know who you are beyond that, and if you don't have sources of meaning in life beyond that sport, it can be such a disorienting experience. And there's now data that shows that rates of anxiety, depression, substance use disorder are markedly higher in transitioning elite athletes, those that are transitioning out of sport. It's okay to care deeply about something and to want to be great and to want to attain mastery. And it's okay to spend a lot of time in that domain so long as you don't leave the others completely behind.
Rick Hansen is he's been a mentor of mine for a number of years, and one of the very first things he said to me was, be a decathlete.
Really?
Have
Oh, what a great quote.
be good at a lot of things, and don't just put all of your energy into one thing. And if you're and I think he's an example of a decathlete. Like, he's got his hands in a lot of different things, and but he also has a through line through
And
them all,
that's the
right?
integration, right? Those are like in my
Yeah.
metaphor, the hallways that connect the rooms.
So having a through lines, and those through lines could be your sense of purpose or your values or the things that you want to be at the forefront of how you act and how you are in the world. Once a week, I'll make sourdough bread. And the process of making sourdough bread is you have to turn it every 45 minutes for a few hours. And so I'll come down, I'll see a client, no matter what session I have, I know I'm going to go up to my house and I'm going to turn my bread. And I have some bread at the end of the day that I'm going to bake. And that helps me be able to see that I'm more than whatever's happening in my therapy room. And if I have a terrible loaf of bread, it's not the end of the world because I also was doing other things today. But being a decathlete, whether it's coaching our kids to do that because there's an over indexing on children being like have to be excellent in one area, and you see this with sports in children and academics in children, all sorts of things, helping them have many interests that they pursue. And it becomes a bit of a buffer for when something in one area doesn't go so well. So I love that.
And what I'm here to say
Um,
is, even for the person, Diana, that says, well, that's fine, it's a cost worth paying, which I don't agree with, but I want to be great. I want to be the best in the
mhm.
world at what I do. And there's research that shows that your chance of being the best in the world at what you do, your chance of being great, is very much proportional to having multiple rooms in your identity house. So it's not just about
Yeah.
feeling good, it's also about doing good. There's this huge misconception that early and stringent specialization is what leads to greatness. It's in part perpetuated by the 10,000 hour rule, which we now know is like sounds nice, but not very scientific. And in fact, what the research shows is that individuals that have a lot of exploration, and only then after they've explored, they figure out what to exploit, what to go deep on, they tend to perform much better. And you look at really interesting case studies of creatives and intellects, and they constantly go through their own cycle of explore and exploit. So they'll zoom out and they'll explore different interests in different domains in different fields of work. And then they'll have that aha moment where things congeal, and then they'll exploit. They'll go write a book or write a paper or do breakthrough research. And that might be an 8-year cycle. And then they come out and then they start exploring broadly again.
Yeah.
And then they
Yeah.
exploit.
Stephen Batchelor, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's
I
a
am.
secular Buddhist. He's written a lot on secular Buddhism. And his book that is coming out that he's working on now is looking at Socrates and the Buddha and
Oh, neat.
I guess they lived at like the same time period. And he's exploring the overlap and the integration, and the differentiation of these two figures that really shaped, philosophy and our, the way that we see the world and the similarities between them. And he had to leave Buddhism. He had to leave Buddhism to be able to expand his understanding and deepen his understanding of Buddhism. And I definitely find that if I were only to talk to people within the field of psychology, and I see these silos that happen within the field of psychology where you actually get more narrow in your thinking over time. You don't get more expansive in your thinking over time when you're only deepening your interest in just one area. Imagine your weightlifting influences your writing
Oh,
and
100%.
or your parenting, or all these things. Okay, so here's another question for you, which we've been talking a little bit about values. How might you use your core values, the rugged and flexible boundaries of your identity, which we could elaborate on what that means, to help you navigate the challenges in your life, Brad?
Mm. So let's start with the rugged and flexible boundaries of your identity. When I was preparing for this interview, I hope that we get here because this feels like a very Diana Hill topic. So the way that I think
Mhm.
about this, and I'll be curious to hear your take, is that self and identity as a process is really strong, if for no other reason than it's empirically true. I am a different person now than I was 10 years ago. I'm a different person now than I was yesterday. I'm a different person depending on how I sleep, if I'm hungry, my relational status, all sorts of things. So we are a process. We are not a static entity. There's this beautiful quote from Heraclitus that I can't step into the same river twice because every time you step into the river, you are a different person. And of course, the river is different. And there's this imagery throughout all sorts of wisdom traditions, all the way up to more recent times in Bruce Lee saying, be like water, that equates a fluid, flexible identity with water. Now, what's fascinating is that if you think about a river has to have a bank or a boundary. Otherwise, it's just a puddle, it's chaotic. So, a part of what creates this imagery of being like water, of flowing over and around obstacles, of moving downstream. A river is a process, right? A part of what creates that process is the container that channels it, the boundaries. And I take that metaphor and I apply it to our identity. And I say, yes, we are a process, but something has to be driving that evolution. We could just leave it up to chance, but I argue that it's better to try to drive that evolution and set your own boundary. And then the boundary, those are your core values. So you can't control the changes and what's going to happen. And you cannot stay the same. Cling as you want. Aging is going to come for you. Change is going to come. But what you can hold on to are your core values. And you can use those core values to make decisions amidst uncertainty. And in many ways, your core values, that's the engine that like drives the process of identity. And the question that I often get asked is, well, can't your core values change? And the answer is, of course, your core values can change. And even then, though, it's your old core values that take you to your new ones. That's what I mean by having the rugged and flexible boundaries of your core values.
Yeah, I adore that metaphor. I think it's fabulous. I love the seeing the values is the stability in the instability. And what are those for you right now at this point in your life? What are the core values that are the banks of that river?
Yeah. So it's interesting. My core values are just love and life. Uh, that's really broad though. And I got to those after like years of playing around with core values frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
So love, that's the being qualities and the relational qualities. So underneath love is presence. And I define that as being really there for the people and things I care about. And then also community. And under community is family. So I'm the king of, forced prioritization. I pick the highest terms. Um, and then life for me is health and vitality and authenticity. And I've been thinking more about this, and particularly in all pursuits of life, but in my writing, the people I admire most, they speak their truth, and they do so elegantly and poignantly and tactfully, but they're really committed to it, even when the consequences of speaking their truth might run against short-term goals. Um,
Hmm.
so I would say that if I were to take love and life and say that that might be a little too broad, it would be presence, community, authenticity, and health. Um, those are my four core values right now, and that might shift. I try to do this. It's an arbitrary time, but everyone is thinking about resolutions, and I don't so much love the idea of resolutions, but I do like using the turn of the year to take stock of your core values. So I'll do that again this year. But those, my guess, will still be pretty resonant.
I like that you asked the question, the people that you admire most, because that's a great way to get at values. And for some people, if you were to ask that question, who are the people that you admire most? They wouldn't say it's the people that speak their authenticity, even when it's challenging. They may say something else about who they admire and why they admire. So you could ask that question of yourself: who is it that you admire, and why do you admire them? What are they doing? Because values are such a embodied practice. They're about action. They're not just about. It's like if you value your family, what are you doing within that domain that demonstrates that value? Because I would say family's like a room, and then how do you show up in that room, right? I also like that you said you take stock in that they can change. Love is often what it all boils down to.
Right, and that's my
Um,
problem, by the way. Like, I went through this
yeah,
exercise with my own therapist, and,
yeah,
um, it just it all comes back to, like, wanting to love and wanting to be loved. Um,
right.
and then the life part is someone that, struggles with, obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety. That is really the showing up and not letting anxiety diminish showing up and make life smaller. So to live fully and take fear along for the ride, to show up, to do things in the world. That is life to me. And then love is the more being state um, of giving and receiving and really feeling like you belong. And it's in a way, pretty nice and poignant, but in a way, it's also a cop out because, like you said, everything boils down to love and life, which is
Yeah.
why I do think it's important to get a little bit more like a double click on, okay, well, then how do you do that? Um, and to your point, even a triple click. Great. So community is important. And underneath community, you have your relationship to Caitlin, your relationship to your kids, and then your relationship to friends that are in different geographies, like lifelong friends, and then your relationship to Asheville, where you live. And then for each of those, like when the rubber meets the road, when we get away from the esoteric love is beautiful, does that mean putting your phone away on Saturday? Does that mean showing up to volunteer coach neighborhood basketball? Does that mean scheduling a call with Justin in Oakland once a week, even if it feels like you're too busy? And I think once we get to that level, to your point, then our values become real. They've got to be the actions that guide our life.
Right. They're the actions that guide your life, and that's how you make your decisions. And if you're in a state of indecision, it can feel like a real struggle until you contact the value, because when you contact the value, it becomes very clear. And sometimes it's uncomfortable to pursue that value, but it also feels very self-motivating to do so. Um, so one more question for you. Yeah, this is the fifth one. So the last question you have, which relates to action, you just naturally took us there. It all flows. Is in what circumstances do you tend to react when you would benefit from responding? And what conditions, so looking at context again, what conditions predispose you to that? So we're talking about reacting versus responding here, like how we can actually act on our values, respond from our values, as opposed to just reacting impulsively. How's
Yeah,
that
this
for
is
you?
this is this is an easy one for me to name, and it very much relates to those mornings uh,
Mhm.
where we started. And it doesn't happen often, but it happens more often than I'd like, which is in the hustle and the rush to get the kids out to school, our younger one to daycare, our older one to kindergarten. Uh, 5.5, 6 year olds, they take their time and they have all sorts of ideas and they stumble upon a leaf outside and then want to slow down and pick it up. And it's terrible, but sometimes I will react in those situations and I'll just like take the leaf from my kid and be like, all right, this leaf is nice, but now it's time to go to school. But sometimes the energy I bring to that, I then look at the look on my kid's face and he looks heartbroken. And within a millisecond, like I am now heartbroken. And to me, that is a reaction. There's a more skillful way to handle that challenge. And I'm not a perfectionist and I'm not going to get it right every time, but I want to work towards getting it right more often than not. We have a rule that we try to abide by in our house that our son knows, which is the only time mom and dad yell is if there's something for safety. So like if you're going to
Mhm.
run into the main road or you're going to put your face in, the dog that lives on our street that's very aggressive, like that is Theo, stop, like you yell. But otherwise, we try to practice never yelling in our family. But every once in a while in the morning, it's Theo, come on. And again, that look on his face, it's not a look that I ever want to elicit in my young child. And that all comes
Yeah.
out of a reaction in that moment. And what are the preconditions that get me to that reaction? It's that false expectation that mornings are going to be productive.
And you're not alone in that, Brad. I teach yoga once a week at my kids' school. And just this week on Tuesday, I opened up the circle because I was late. I was late to the yoga class because I was working. And I was like, I was late and I was rushing and I got here, but can we all be in the circle together and settle and be here, kind of let our nervous system settle a little bit. And I asked the class, these are a class of fifth graders, what happens when your caregiver is running late in the morning? And they just started sharing. They get angry, they get stressed, they get mean, they get mad. And I heard all these children's voices talking about their caregivers in this way of what's it like to be a kid in the morning with these parents. And this is a universal experience of parents. If we have lots of things to do, we have too many demands on us and often not enough resources to meet those demands. And for some people, way more demands on them and way fewer resources to meet those demands. And our response to that is to react. But it does have these consequences. So we talked in that in that morning, or what we practiced in that morning, is we did a little breath work together, and we talked about how to, even when that reactivity is coming at us, how can we find centeredness, stability within our own bodies and feel safe with our own bodies? Because for a kid, the yell is threat,
Right.
because they're dependent on you. I mean, their nervous system is completely dependent on your nervous system. And so I think that is something that we all struggle with, and also
Yeah.
something that as parents we can all work towards.
And it's not just in those moments. I think that's where it's most acute for me, or where it's most salient, and where I feel the worst about it, because it's my
Mm-hmm.
kid. But in general, I think it's a values conflict for me between life and love, because life is trying to cram as much in as I can and get everything I can out of life. And as a result of that, I often don't build in enough transition time between my day, and I can rush from one thing to the next. I show up for life and I live a lot of life, but the love is directly like improportionate to the rush. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
finding a more appropriate balance between life and love, or doing and being, and down regulating doing so that there can be some more being. And instead of a 8-minute shower, maybe take a 14-minute shower. Simply because then the nervous system, like you said, it can calm down and it can be more in a state that's ready for the next thing. So I think more globally, something I am actively working on is just building in more transition time. But that's hard,
Yes.
because like the value of life just says, like, like, get everything you can out of this. You're only here once. And I don't want to lose that, because my temperament is not one that is wired to be a Zen master. But if I over index on that temperament, I leave a lot of love behind, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah, that's the power of margins. When you used to write a paper for school, they'd force your margins. Like, you have to have a certain size margin, and you have to have things double spaced, because you need the space to be able to have the edits or write the comments, or be able to take in the picture. And when we pack everything in, as we've done today, Brad, we got 2 minutes and you got to go to see a client. When we pack everything in, we don't have that space to really take in and be in our lives, and also be able to respond. So that's something you teach in the book too. You talk about the 4 P's of being responsive, and you'll have to pick up the book to figure out what those 4 P's are, kind of leave some cliffhangers for you all. It's fantastic. Master of Change. I loved it. I love your work. I love following you and seeing how you're evolving as an author and a father and a friend, and all the different roles that you have. And I really appreciate the time that you took to in your busy life to do this podcast. So thank you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.